I'm Rob Skinner, and this is the Rob Skinner Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to give a recap of my recent trip to the Exponential Church Planting Conference held in the San Francisco Bay Area in late October of 2024. All this and more on the Rob Skinner Podcast. Welcome back to the Rob Skinner Podcast. My goal is to inspire you to live a no-regrets life, make this life count, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. I just got back from the Bay Area. This is Saturday, October 26th, and this last Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday was the Exponential Church Planting Conference held in the San Francisco Bay Area, Castro Valley in particular, at Three Crosses Churches. This is a evangelical conference, and it pulls ministers from all different types of denominations. But it's something I got invited to, and I thought this would be really good for me to go and check out and see if I could just pick up some ideas because, you know, I want to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches, and that's the express purpose of this conference. So I want to talk a little bit about the highlights. It started off on midday on Tuesday, and I was able to spend the night with Brock and Ann Roby, who lead a church there in the Bay Area. They're great friends and discipling partners, and so we just had a blast. That was just totally awesome to spend time with them every evening. I brought my wife Pam with me. And so the first speaker was a church leader named Ryan Kwan. He talked about that the problem is we're building the church without making disciples. Now this, if you are part of a discipling movement, you're like, okay, that verbiage sounds super familiar, but it's interesting how all churches, or at least many churches, are latching onto this idea of making disciples. So I thought that was very interesting. And he just talked about how crowds don't advance the kingdom, but disciples do. And he talked about Matthew chapter 28, and he said we basically need to return to making disciples, and he even referenced Robert Coleman, who's so influential in writing the book back in the early 60s, the Master Plan of Evangelism, which was so influential, especially in the discipling movement or the Boston movement that many of us are a part of. Then the second speaker was a guy named Dave Lomas. He leads a church called Reality in San Francisco. He talks about Augustine and how everyone loves someone, and how in order to really inspire people, you've got to get them to love Jesus a whole bunch more. And so I thought that was really interesting. So kind of it was a good second class. And then there was an afternoon class led by Robbie Engel. I walked into the class and I thought, I think I know this guy, and I don't know how. I just saw the name. Turns out I'm sitting there talking to him, and I said, didn't I interview you on my podcast? And I had. I'd interviewed him back, and he had written a book on the cure for small groups. And so he said, oh, yeah, okay, thank you so much. You did a great job with podcasting. So he talked about how to build a leadership pipeline, and that was really good. He uses Right Now Media, which has like a discipleship framework. And he just talked about, do you have a plan to disciple adults? Do you have a way to produce leaders? Again, he mentioned the Master Plan of Evangelism. And he just gave some ideas for forming groups and supporting leadership. He said you've got to focus on high-quality people, high-quality guys in particular. Don't compromise. You need to have a model of an exceptional leader and help people to develop in a community of guys, which, you know, it's. I totally agree. I mean, I feel like if you're going to raise up leaders, you have to share your life with them. That's why I like going backpacking, doing things out where guys in particular, of course I'm a guy, but guys bond. And I think in activities, doing things that force you to really communicate and get close to people. So that was very encouraging that he talked about that. He went on and he just talked about his programming, what he does. He talked about cycles of growth. And he just talked about how it takes about 3 years to raise up leaders. So you need to have like a mindset that it's going to take a little while. In any case, it was a good class, and I think it confirmed in my mind it takes time to build good leaders, and it takes developing family. There needs to be a program. You've got to have a great program. It echoed what Mike Fontenot had said in that class I did, or that interview I did a few back. You need to have a leadership training program. And so that was very encouraging, but also satisfying. And he also recommended a book called Living Fearless. And I'm just starting to read that, so that should be really good. And he talked about how you need to really confront, what are you really thinking in your relationship with God? What's really going on? And that you need to fearlessly confront the actual ideas that you have in your relationship with God without trying to be overly religious, but just real with God. And so that was really good. And he recommended I go to his website, truefacjourney.com, TRUE face, FACE, journey.com. And so that was a good class. I like that. Then at the end of that day, it really was powerful, because a guy named Evan from Zimbabwe shared, and he talked about the courage to say yes. And he was a minister to Zimbabwe, a missionary. And he started off really light, and he just talked about his church that he was leading in Zimbabwe, and it had like 35, but he said that actually only about 15 people were there. He called, how we stretch the statistics, he calls it being evangelistic in our numbers. I had to laugh. But he talked about how he started to really get frustrated with the corruption in the country, and so he posted online a call for people to speak the truth in love, and he called the government to really stop being so corrupt, essentially. And that was the Robert Mugabe dictatorship that had been in place since 1980, so it had been there for like 36 years. And he just talked about all the persecution he received as a result of that, and how so many people had listened to his podcast. And he talked about how courage is the decision to act on the things that you care about, and how you need to make a decision and decide. He talked about how decide, the very origin of the word is to cut off from yourself the exits, and how obedience to God's instructions are absolutely essential, that there's no courage without obedience. You have to be obedient no matter what. And he talked about being needy and dependent on God, and how we need God. And he was arrested 8 times. In 2017, Mugabe was removed from power. Another dictator took his place. He escaped. He received tons of persecution. He was thrown in jail, but he escaped, and then he decided to go back to the country. Before he got off the airplane, officials got on the plane, arrested him. He was tortured. And he just shared so many stories. It inspired me. I just thought, dang, Rob, you got to be so much more courageous, and just really put yourself in that kind of position. So that was a great class. It really hit my heart. I just was crying. I went up and took a picture with him, and just thanked him so much for his example in his life and of being fearless. And he just talked about how you never know how God's going to use you. He said this church wasn't exactly cranking at the time, but he was being tried one night, and they couldn't get him to the jail because a group of 100 people had shown up at the court to block it and to try to get him out of jail. And then a few hours passed, and then there were 500, and then 10,000 people. And so they released him that night, and they were going to throw him back into jail again the next day, but he escaped the country. So very, very powerful story. I was really glad I heard that. The next day, I went to a class from Brian at Casey Underground, and he talked about microchurches. And he said how if you want to get microchurches going, you first got to ask why. Everyone needs to ask that question of why you want to do that. And he talked about how everyone has a set body of good works prepared in advance for God to do, because that's what it says in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, which is really encouraging. You think about how God's already prepared it. He's already set those works in advance for us to do. We just need to be open to it. We've got to just be looking for what those good works are. And he talked about, how to get these small churches going or micro churches. He talked about extraordinary prayer and fasting, just like Jesus. And he said that you've got to be living as missionaries. You got to plant the gospel. And then over time, the church emerges and then starts to multiply. He said you need to ask two questions. First, Jesus, where are you at work? Where's God working? And that's what you need to identify that and ask God, Jesus, where are you working? And then secondly, how can I join you there? So he said that, Jesus is always working. There's always growth centers. You need to identify where those are and then get involved. And so I thought that was a very, very good class. And then a guy named Will Chung, who leads a church in Buena Park in Orange County, got up and shared. He talked about, sometimes we feel burned out, but a lot of times it comes from pretending to be fired up when we're really not. And he said, don't try to be more generous than God. You got to be filled up. And he gave a quote from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who just said, you've got to be filled up like a lake until it's overflowing before you can really give to others. Not like a canal. You need to be filling yourselves up. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting spot. And he just really got vulnerable. And he just shared that prior in 2020, he had a mental breakdown. He used those words. He had a mental breakdown. He got help. He had to really, turn to get some good counseling. And he says you need to take times of extended periods of non-production. You can't just keep grinding away. You've got to take some time away to break. But after that time, he really rejuvenated his relationship with God, and then he went on to plant a church in Southern California. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Appreciated the guy's openness. I thought that was really good. Then I went to a class by Larry Walkemeyer, and this guy planted a church, planted a church. It was a Free Methodist church, and a very small church in North Long Beach, kind of a rough area, only had 39 parking spots. This was like the early 90s. But he had a dream to plant a mega church, but he knew it'd never happen in that kind of setting. So that's when he got the idea to start sending off churches. And so he just gave a lot of good practicals about what it takes to do that. And I thought he's written quite a few books that I'd like to read. I thought he had some really good ideas. And he just said your church needs to be more like a river, not a lake, in the sense that it's passing on the blessings and not just kind of storing it all up. And that a lot of times we'll focus just on adding people rather than multiplying churches. And that's kind of like why I went to the conference in the first place. So I thought that was very, very helpful for me. And he talked about how you need to have audacious action. You need to dare to try what others say may fail because the risk is worth the prize. And he said you got to have faith. It's a belief that takes daring action and, if necessary, fails. And he talked about how one of the things he did initially to get the first church planting off the ground, he said he's planted 1 or 2 churches every year since the year 2000. And I was just like, wow. And so from that, like 12,000 people have become Christians among all the churches that his small church has sent off. And I thought that was really, really helpful. That was really good. And he just talked about how he kind of had a home Bible talk, and he turned that into a church. That was like his first church planting. He had his regular Sunday service, but in the evenings he'd come home and do a Bible talk, and that became a church. So he just kind of started where he was, and then that became a church planting. So that was very, very good. The next, that same Wednesday, a guy named Felipe Santos talked about we have to wait on the Spirit. He kind of did a long exposition of Acts chapter 1 and how they prayed and they had to wait on the Spirit, and how we need to wait on the Spirit and pray and fast until God gives us clear direction, which I think it's valid. Another guy talked and just said you got to watch your life and doctrine closely. He offered a warning. He brought up the example of Ravi Zacharias, who was a powerful teacher and yet was caught in a scandal. And after he died, it turned out that he had been in a lot of sin. And so very, very interesting. And then finally it ended on Thursday. Thursday, unfortunately, was kind of anticlimactic. It wasn't that great. And so Wednesday and Tuesday were much better. I heard from a woman named Nancy Ortberg, who's the husband or the wife of John Ortberg. But it just didn't really hit for me. Maybe it hit for other people, but I just didn't find it very inspiring. And then we finished out. And then they had people come forward and ask for prayer. I just got to share a funny story. During one of the sessions, I'm not always comfortable with it because it's different than my family of churches. I mean, there's like a big band and smoke and big screen. It's in a mega church, and so I'm just like, wow, this is really different than my small church in Tucson. But anyway, I'm trying to get into it. I'm trying to lift up my hands and stuff like that, trying to be flexible in my thinking. So the speaker gets up there and says, hey, how many people out there came just feeling like they need to be filled up? They feel like they're kind of empty and they want to be filled up. I'm like, yeah, I could raise my hand to that. Yeah, I mean, that's the reason why I came here is to learn. You know, I'm not, if I knew everything, I wouldn't be here. So I raised my hand and they said, okay, just keep your eyes closed. Now, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, I want you to look around and find someone who's got their hand raised. I want you to put their hand on them. And I want you to pray over them, and we're going to pray over those people right now. And so the speaker up on stage starts praying, you know, that God will bless us and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden I feel this hand on my shoulder. And there's this voice that's kind of sub-vocalizing and praying like in a real low voice, like right behind me. He's like, I want to just pray for this brother that his lungs are just filled with the Spirit of God, and just God just be with him, just help him. God, just powerful. Just fill him up with power. Just help and encourage him. I was just feeling so uncomfortable. I mean, it's just like, this feels really weird. But anyway, it finally ended, and I turned around and gave the guy a handshake, and he goes, hi, my name's Brett. I said, my name's Rob. Thank you. And I just went on to the next session. But anyway, it's just always good to kind of have new experiences. But they had a call forward at the very end to pray over you if you want to plant other churches, and I didn't go forward at this time, but I am praying that to continue to plant more churches. But it was a good conference. I think I learned stuff. I think there were other things that I learned too along the way. Just really thinking deeply, praying and fasting, and just coming away and just going, okay, what do I need to do to help get more churches going? And really praying, and what price is it going to be to multiply churches and leaders? And so I thought that was very valuable. I think it was good just to learn from other people, no matter the source. I just thought, you know, I think the way forward is we definitely are going to need a lot more bivocational ministers for sure. And so that was great. And so I just kind of came up with ideas, and in the evenings we'd go home, I'd spend time, have dinner with Brock and Ann. We'd just kind of brainstorm and talk about ideas for how we can advance the kingdom. And so it was a great time. So that was it. Exponential West Coast 2024. It was a great time. Thanks for listening. Here's how you can help support the program. First, let your friends know about the podcast. Secondly, read and review one of my books, How to Plant and Grow a Church, or Courage, How to Make This Life Count. You can find them on Amazon.com. And if you've read them already, please give me a review. Please go on there and just let me know what you think, and give me a 5-star if you think it's worth it, or whatever you think. Finally, support the church, support the program with a gift today. The link is in the show notes. Really easy to do, because my goal is to inspire you to make this life count, live a no regrets life, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Have a great day, and make this life count.